Week 13 on its way after Wednesday night's ball game. We finally saw Week 12 come to an end, and here's 5 guys I'm going to look to start at kicker heading into Week 13. The first guy is Chris Boswell of the Pittsburgh Steelers. Boswell, he didn't have a great game versus Baltimore yesterday. Only with 4 fantasy points, and he missed another extra point, but this week he's got a great matchup in Week 13 versus the Washington football team. They give up the 11th most fantasy points to kickers. And Boswell, I think in this game, there are going to be more opportunities and more chances for him to kick a couple field goals through the uprights. I know he's been struggling this year, but I like him this week versus Washington. It's a good matchup, and like I said, they're going to have a lot of chances, Pittsburgh is, in this ball game. The second kicker I'm going to start is Harrison Butker of the Kansas City Chiefs. Butker, another guy with kicking extra points, is a problem this season. And Butker, just a lot of extra points he kicks in general because this Chief offense punches the ball into the end zone. But this week he versus the Denver Broncos, and in their Week 7 matchup, he had 11 fantasy points on the day, which is one of his best games of the season. So Butker here, I think he can have a good game versus Denver. That's the Sunday night game in Kansas City. And Butker, I could finally see him get double-digit fantasy points here once again. Third kicker I'm looking to start this week's Jason Myers of the Seattle Seahawks. Myers here, he's been playing well as of late and getting more opportunities finally. Still, he's only hit 11 field goals the whole season, is Myers. And now he's got the New York Giants coming into Seattle, and they give up the 17th most fantasy points to kickers. So Jason Myers, I think he'll do good. I think he'll be all right, and he'll get more opportunities. The Giants have been struggling, and they need to can't stop no one really. So Myers, I could see him getting 3 or 4 attempts, and he's got double-digit fantasy points at the kicker position 3 out of his last 4 games. The fourth kicker is Tyler Bass of the Buffalo Bills. Bass, he's been on a mission this year in fantasy football. In the last 5 weeks, he's really picked it up, is Bass, on the season, with double-digit fantasy points 4 out of the 5 games. He's coming off an 18 and then 11-point fantasy day at the kicker position. And this week he goes to San Francisco. But San Francisco, their home games now are going to be in Arizona Stadium, which is going to be good for Tyler Bass. It's going to be indoors. Last time he played there was in Week 10, where he had 18 fantasy points with 3+ 50-yard field goals. So Bass here, he likes kicking there, obviously. He had success in Week 10. And now here in Week 13 versus San Francisco, gives up the 6th most fantasy points to kickers. I could see Bass having a huge ball game once again in this one. And the 5th and final kicker I'm looking to start this week's Dan Bailey of the Minnesota Vikings. Bailey's got a great matchup versus a weak Jacksonville defense that gives up the 4th most fantasy points to kickers. Bailey, he's out there in a bunch of leagues as well, 68% of leagues. Bailey, he hasn't been that good this season, so this is a one matchup type of thing for the start this week. Last week he finally had a double-digit game with 10 fantasy points versus Carolina with a 53-yarder, a 25-yarder, and 2 PATs. And this week versus Jacksonville, I could see similar numbers here for Dan Bailey. Plus, they're at home once again, and there's no better place to kick than at home and indoors. So right here, that's 5 kickers I'm going to start heading into Week 13.